What would you do if you discovered that the quaint family home you purchased was built upon a foundation of unspeakable horror? How would you react if the strange dampness in your basement led you to uncover secrets buried for generations? Secrets that an entire town had worked to forget. In the sweltering summer of 1921, as the cicadas droned their endless chorus across the red clay hills of Macon County, Georgia, a discovery was made that would haunt the nightmares of local residents for decades to come. What began as a routine inspection of a recently purchased property on the outskirts of a small farming community called Whispering Pines would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing cases in Georgia's criminal history, a case so horrific that official records were deliberately obscured and witnesses were encouraged to take their testimonies to their graves. The property in question was a stately two-story farmhouse situated on 20 acres of fertile land, featuring a wraparound porch, detailed gingerbread trim, and a deep well that had provided water to generations of residents. Built in 1872 by Jeremiah Caldwell, a Civil War veteran who had returned from the conflict, a changed man. The house had changed hands several times before being purchased by Thomas and Eleanor Whitaker in the spring of 1921. The Whitakers, a young couple from Atlanta seeking rural tranquility to raise their expected child, had been drawn to the property's pastoral charm and isolation. The previous owners, the Hendersons, had sold the house at a price that local realtors considered suspiciously below market value. When questioned about this discrepancy, Martha Henderson had simply remarked that the house had a dampness that wouldn't leave, and that sometimes at night the well water smelled of something that wasn't right. Dismissing these comments as the superstitions of aging country folk, the Whitakers eagerly took possession of their new home in early June. Their excitement, however, was short-lived. From the first night, something felt wrong about the place, Eleanor Whitaker would later tell investigators, her hands trembling as she clutched a handkerchief. The air was thick, almost like it was trying to suffocate you, and there was a sound, not exactly a voice, but something almost like weeping coming through the floorboards. Thomas said it was just the house settling, but houses don't settle with a sound like that. Houses don't settle with a sound like someone trying not to be heard. Within weeks of moving in, the Whitakers began experiencing a series of disturbances that defied rational explanation. Doors would close themselves, objects would disappear, only to reappear days later in unexpected locations. Most troubling were the persistent nightmares that plagued them both, dreams of dark, confined spaces, and the sensation of being buried alive while faceless figures looked down from above. The breaking point came when Eleanor, then 5 months pregnant, awoke one night to find muddy footprints leading from the cellar door to their bedroom. The footprints, small enough to belong to a child, stopped at the foot of their bed. "I knew then that we weren't alone in that house," Eleanor's statement continues. "Whatever was there, it wanted us to know it. It wanted us to look deeper." Alarmed by these occurrences and concerned for his wife's declining health, Thomas Whitaker contacted local contractor Samuel Bishop to inspect the property's foundation, suspecting that perhaps groundwater was seeping into the cellar and causing structural damage that could explain some of the phenomena they had experienced. Bishop arrived on July 12, 1921, a date that would eventually be marked in local records as the beginning of the Caldwell Horror, named after the property's original owner. What Bishop discovered in the course of his inspection would shatter the peaceful facade of Whispering Pines and expose a darkness that had festered beneath the community for decades. According to the official report filed with the Macon County Sheriff's Department, Bishop's initial examination of the cellar revealed nothing unusual beyond expected moisture issues common to structures of that age. However, when he began inspecting the well located approximately 30 feet from the main house, he noticed irregularities in the stonework approximately 15 feet below the surface. The stones didn't match up right, Bishop noted in his testimony, like someone had taken apart the well and put it back together in a hurry. And there was a sort of mortar used that was different, newer than the rest. "I've been building and fixing things in this county for 30 years, and I know when something ain't right." Curious about this anomaly, Bishop lowered a lantern deeper into the well to get a better look at the inconsistent stonework. What he saw caused him to immediately contact the sheriff's office. Sheriff William Harding arrived at the Caldwell property by mid-afternoon, accompanied by Deputy James Tucker and the county coroner, Dr. Elijah Montgomery. After examining the well himself, Sheriff Harding ordered excavation equipment to be brought to the site. By nightfall, as kerosene lamps cast long shadows across the property, the team had carefully removed the section of irregular stonework, revealing what appeared to be a small chamber extending horizontally from the well shaft. What they found inside that chamber would horrify even the most hardened law enforcement officers. The official report, portions of which were later sealed by court order, described the discovery in clinical terms. Upon breaching the secondary chamber, officers discovered the remains of what appeared to be human bodies in various states of decomposition. Initial count suggests multiple individuals. The reality, as pieced together through witness statements and the few surviving official documents, was far more gruesome. The chamber contained the remains of 11 individuals, primarily women and children, arranged in a circular pattern around the periphery of the space. The bodies showed evidence of having been meticulously preserved through a crude embalming process before being sealed within the chamber. More disturbing still were the personal effects found with each body. Dolls with their eyes removed, placed in the arms of the children, wedding rings still adorning the fingers of the women, and small wooden plaques with inscriptions such as unworthy, impure, and failed him, placed upon their chests. In all my years as coroner, I have never witnessed such deliberate care taken with such a horrific act, Dr. Montgomery wrote in his personal journal, which was discovered among his effects after his death in 1935. It was not a crime of passion or convenience, but something performed with ritual precision. The perpetrator wanted these people preserved, not merely disposed of. It was as if he was creating a collection. As news of the discovery spread through Whispering Pines, a palpable tension descended upon the community. Doors were locked at night. Children were kept close to home, and whispers began to circulate about Jeremiah Caldwell, the house's builder and original owner, who had lived there in isolation with his extended family until his death in 1898. Investigation into local records revealed troubling details about Caldwell's history. After returning from the Civil War, Caldwell had established himself as a successful farmer and something of a religious figure in the community. He had taken in numerous relatives, nieces, nephews, cousins, following the economic hardships of the Reconstruction era, creating what some described as a family compound centered around strict adherence to Caldwell's particular interpretation of biblical scripture. Neighbors recalled the Caldwell household as unusually quiet, despite the number of people supposedly living there. Children were rarely seen outside, and the women of the household appeared in town only on rare occasions, always heavily supervised by Jeremiah himself. Those weren't children living a normal life, stated Margaret Wilson, who had been a young girl in a neighboring farm during the Caldwell years. When you'd catch sight of them at church or in town, they had this look, like beaten dogs that expect another kick. They spoke when spoken to, moved when told to move, and never ever smiled. And every few months there'd be one less of them. Jeremiah would say they'd gone to stay with other relatives or taken ill and passed, but there were never any funerals. No graves in the churchyard. They just disappeared. According to tax and census records from 1875 to 1895, approximately 23 individuals were listed as residing at the Caldwell property at various times. By the time of Jeremiah's death, only he and his son Ezekiel were registered as occupants. The fate of the others remained unrecorded. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered a journal hidden beneath the floorboards of what had once been Jeremiah Caldwell's study. The journal, written in a meticulous hand, detailed Caldwell's increasingly paranoid religious beliefs and his self-appointed mission to purify his bloodline. "The Lord has shown me the weakness in our family," one entry dated August 1879 reads. "Those who cannot uphold the covenant must be removed, but not discarded. They are still of my blood, though tainted. They must be preserved and kept close, a reminder of failure and a warning to those who remain." Subsequent entries detailed Caldwell's criteria for determining which family members were unfit to continue in his household. Children who showed disobedience or questioned his authority, women who failed to properly manage household duties, or who attempted to communicate with outsiders without permission. Any who exhibited what Caldwell termed moral weakness or susceptibility to worldly corruption. Most chilling were the entries describing the preservation process, Caldwell's detailed documentation of how he sedated his victims using a combination of herbs and alcohol before performing his gruesome work in the chamber he had constructed adjacent to the well. "Tonight I have preserved Elizabeth," reads an entry from April 1882. "Her recent behavior has shown her to be unworthy of continuing in our earthly covenant. She questions too much and has been caught attempting to send letters to people in town. Such defiance cannot be tolerated if the family is to remain pure. She now joins the others in the chamber of reflection, where she will serve as an eternal reminder of the consequences of failing to uphold God's standards as I have interpreted them." The journal indicated that Caldwell had committed his first preservation in 1874, just 2 years after constructing the house, and continued the practice sporadically over the next 20 years. His final entry, dated November 18, 1897, suggested he was planning to preserve his own son Ezekiel, whom he had come to believe was contaminated beyond redemption, after catching him in a romantic entanglement with a young woman from town. Whether this final preservation occurred remains unknown. Historical records indicate that Jeremiah Caldwell died in February 1898, from what was recorded as natural causes, though speculation has persisted that Ezekiel may have turned on his father before he himself could be added to the collection. After Jeremiah's death, Ezekiel sold the property and disappeared from local records. Attempts to trace his whereabouts during the 1921 investigation proved unsuccessful, though rumors placed him in various locations from New Orleans to Chicago, always in proximity to cases involving missing persons or unexplained deaths. The investigation into the well chamber yielded few definitive identifications of the victims. Decomposition and the crude preservation methods had rendered traditional identification difficult, though certain personal effects suggested connections to known missing persons cases from the area during the Caldwell years. A silver locket found on one of the adult female victims contained a photograph matching the description of Catherine Davis, a second cousin of Jeremiah, who had come to live with the family in 1877 after being widowed. Catherine had allegedly moved west in 1879, though no correspondence was ever received from her thereafter. A child's body was tentatively identified as belonging to Thomas Caldwell, Jeremiah's nephew, who had supposedly been sent to a sanitarium in Atlanta in 1884 for nervous disorders. No records of his admission to any such facility were ever located. The discovery at the Caldwell property sent shockwaves through Macon County and beyond. Newspapers as far away as Atlanta and Savannah carried the story, though many details were considered too gruesome for public consumption. The Atlanta Constitution's headline on July 15, 1921, read simply, "Horror unearthed in Macon County well. Multiple victims found." Local reaction to the case was complex and fraught with tension. Many older residents expressed a lack of surprise at the revelations about Jeremiah Caldwell. "There was always something not right about that man," Jacob Stevens, a 78-year-old farmer who had known Caldwell, told investigators. "He spoke of salvation while his eyes held damnation. Some folks around here suspected something wasn't right with how people kept disappearing from that house. But in those days, you didn't question a man about his family business. Not if you wanted to keep peace. Others in the community, particularly those with business or social connections to the subsequent owners of the property, expressed concern about the impact the discovery would have on local property values and the community's reputation. There were whispers about handling the matter discreetly and not dwelling on past tragedies. This sentiment gained traction as the investigation progressed, particularly when it became clear that several prominent local families had connections to the Caldwell household or had been aware of suspicious circumstances but had remained silent. County Commissioner Harold Jennings, whose grandfather had been a frequent business associate of Jeremiah Caldwell, was particularly vocal about the need to put this unfortunate business behind us. By August 1921, less than a month after the initial discovery, Official enthusiasm for the investigation had noticeably waned. Sheriff Harding, who had initially pursued the case with vigor, began to defer to state authorities, who in turn seemed reluctant to allocate resources to crimes committed decades earlier, with no surviving perpetrator to prosecute. On August 23, 1921, a mysterious fire broke out at the county records office, destroying numerous documents related to the case. The fire was officially attributed to faulty electrical wiring, though Deputy Tucker would later claim in a private letter to his sister that he had seen men leaving the building shortly before the blaze was discovered. By September, media coverage had dwindled, and by October the case was effectively closed. The remains discovered in the well chamber were interred in a common grave in the county cemetery, under a marker reading simply, "Victims of tragedy, may they find peace." The Whitakers never returned to live in the house, forfeiting their investment and relocating to Florida, where Eleanor gave birth to a daughter in December 1921. According to hospital records, the child was born with an unusual birthmark across her back that nurses described as resembling handprints, as if someone had reached up from below to grab her. The Caldwell house remained vacant for several years before being purchased at auction by James Harrison, a businessman from Atlanta, with no prior connection to the area. Harrison had the well filled in with concrete and a new water system installed before taking up residence in 1925. Harrison's tenure in the house was brief and troubled. Household staff reported unusual phenomena similar to those experienced by the Whitakers. Objects moved without explanation. Strange sounds emanated from the sealed cellar. Most disturbing were the recurring dreams reported by Harrison and his family, dreams of being trapped in a dark, confined space, while a tall, bearded man in Civil War-era clothing looked down at them, speaking words they could never quite remember upon waking. In 1927, after his wife suffered a nervous breakdown that doctors could not adequately explain, Harrison abandoned the property, boarding up the windows and doors before returning to Atlanta. The house would change hands several more times over the decades, but no owner remained for longer than 2 years. By 1950, local real estate agents had developed an unspoken policy of not actively marketing the property, selling it only to out-of-town buyers unaware of its history. "That land is poisoned," declared Reverend Michael Thompson of the First Baptist Church of Whispering Pines in a sermon delivered in 1948, "not by chemicals or disease, but by the evil that was done there. Some sins seep into the very soil and stone, and no amount of prayer or paint can cover them." As decades passed, the story of the Caldwell horror faded from public consciousness, becoming little more than a local legend, the kind of tale told to frighten children or entertain visitors. The details became distorted, the facts obscured by time and deliberate obfuscation. Yet for those who studied the case closely, troubling questions remained. The official count of 11 bodies recovered from the well chamber did not align with the approximately 20 individuals who had disappeared from the Caldwell household over the years. What had happened to the others? Were there additional chambers yet to be discovered on the property or elsewhere? And what of Ezekiel Caldwell, whose fate remained unknown? In 1963, during renovations to the property by then-owner Richard Foster, workers discovered a sealed crawl space beneath the main staircase. Inside was a small trunk containing children's clothing, all dating from the Caldwell era, meticulously folded and preserved. Each garment bore a small label with a name and what appeared to be an evaluation. Mary failed, Joseph disobedient, Rebecca corrupted. More disturbing was a map found beneath the clothing, drawn in what experts would later confirm was human blood. The map showed the Caldwell property with several locations marked by X's, one corresponding to the well chamber, others scattered across the grounds and beneath the house itself. Before a thorough investigation of these other locations could be organized, Foster ordered the crawl space resealed and denied workers access to the property. 2 weeks later, he sold the house and relocated to California, refusing all subsequent requests for interviews about what had been found. The discovery renewed interest in the case among local historians and amateur sleuths, but efforts to conduct a comprehensive archaeological survey of the property were consistently blocked by a succession of owners and, curiously, by local government. Officials who cited concerns about disturbing the peace of the community and reopening old wounds. A partially redacted memo discovered in 1978 during a routine digitization of county records suggested a more troubling motivation for this resistance. Investigation into additional sites on sea property not recommended. Prominent families, see attached list, implicated in knowledge concealment. Potential civil unrest and severe economic impact to region if full extent revealed. The attached list referenced in the memo was missing from the files. Dr. Rebecca Collins, a forensic anthropologist who reviewed the available evidence in 1989 for a proposed academic study on historical crimes in the rural South, found the official handling of the case deeply suspicious. What we see in the Caldwell case is a textbook example of institutional suppression, Collins wrote in notes that were never formally published. The physical evidence, what little survived, points to a horror far more extensive than officially acknowledged. The 11 victims found represent only the tip of the iceberg. The real question isn't what Jeremiah Caldwell did. We know he was a murderer and likely suffered from severe paranoid delusions. The question is, why so many people worked so hard, both during his lifetime and after the discoveries in 1921, to conceal the full extent of his crimes. Collins's research was abruptly terminated when her university funding was cut after what her department chair described as pressure from unexpected quarters. Her research materials were subsequently lost in what the university claimed was a routine archival reorganization. Throughout the following decades, the property continued to change hands regularly, with each new owner seemingly unaware of or choosing to ignore its grim history. Local real estate disclosure laws, even when strengthened in the 1990s, contained curious exemptions for historical incidents not directly affecting the structural integrity of the property. In 2003, during the installation of fiber optic cables in the rural areas surrounding Whispering Pines, workers uncovered a small metal box buried approximately 4 feet beneath what had once been the outer edge of the Caldwell property. The box contained several glass photographic plates dating from the 1800s. The images on the plates, though partially degraded, clearly showed Jeremiah Caldwell standing beside what appeared to be bodies arranged in seated positions, around a table, as if participating in a macabre dinner party. The faces of the bodies had been carefully blurred on the original plates, suggesting that even Caldwell himself recognized the need to obscure the identity of his victims. Most disturbing was an inscription on the back of one plate, written, in what handwriting experts confirmed, matched Jeremiah Caldwell's journal entries, "The family eternal." Though they failed in life, in preservation they serve eternally as reminders of the consequences of moral weakness. The great work continues. This final phrase, "the great work continues," would take on particular significance in light of subsequent events. In 2010, graduate student Michael Reynolds began researching a thesis on the psychological profiles of 19th-century familicide cases with the Caldwell horror as his primary focus. Reynolds's investigation led him to track the descendants of Ezekiel Caldwell, the son who had disappeared after selling the family property. What Reynolds discovered was a disturbing pattern spanning generations. In multiple cities across the American South and Midwest, descendants of Ezekiel Caldwell had been linked to cases involving missing persons, particularly within family units. While none had been convicted of crimes, the statistical clustering of disappearances around these individuals could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. Most alarming was Reynolds's discovery that several descendants had worked in professions with access to wells, underground infrastructure, or burial sites. Well diggers, cemetery caretakers, subway construction workers, and urban planners specializing in underground utilities. The pattern suggests a hereditary compulsion, Reynolds wrote in research notes, that would later be found in his abandoned apartment, not just to kill, but to preserve and conceal beneath the earth. It's as if Jeremiah Caldwell's pathology didn't die with him, but was somehow transmitted through generations of his bloodline. Reynolds never completed his thesis. In April 2011, he abruptly withdrew from his university program and disappeared. His vehicle was later found near the Caldwell property, but no trace of Reynolds himself was ever discovered, despite an extensive search of the area. His final email to his academic advisor, sent the day before his disappearance, contained only a single line: "I believe they know I've found them. The great work continues." Law enforcement officials labeled Reynolds' disappearance a probable suicide, pointing to his obsession with the Caldwell case and evidence of recent mental health struggles. The case was closed after 6 months of fruitless investigation. Yet for those familiar with the history of the Caldwell horror, Reynolds' disappearance represented another link in a chain of suppressed evidence and unexplained occurrences stretching back nearly 150 years. A chain suggesting that the horror discovered in that well chamber in 1921 was neither the beginning nor the end of the story. In 2019, the last standing structure of the original Caldwell property, a storage shed that had somehow survived decades of renovations and demolitions, was finally torn down to make way for a new housing development. During excavation for the development's community swimming pool, workers discovered something unexpected, approximately 12 feet below the surface: a circular chamber constructed of brick and mortar, roughly 15 feet in diameter. Inside, the chamber were what appeared to be furniture and personal effects, arranged as if for a formal dinner party, though no human remains were present. A table was set with fine china, crystal glasses and silver cutlery, all dating from the late 1800s. 11 chairs surrounded the table, each bearing a name carved into the back, names that matched those of the victims found in the well chamber almost 100 years earlier. At the head of the table was a larger chair, ornately carved with biblical scenes depicting judgment and damnation. Carved into its back was a message: "When the time comes, all will be seated at the table of judgment. The great work continues." Construction was immediately halted, and authorities were notified. However, before a proper archaeological investigation could begin, the site was severely damaged by what officials described as unexpected groundwater seepage, filling the chamber and causing a partial collapse that rendered detailed examination impossible. The development company, citing safety concerns and financial pressures, obtained special permission to seal the chamber with concrete and continue construction. Today, where the Caldwell house once stood, a modern subdivision called Wellspring Estates houses dozens of families, most unaware of what lies beneath their carefully landscaped yards and community amenities. The development's sales brochures highlight its deep historical roots in the community and connection to the natural springs that have nourished this land for generations. Yet among long-time residents of the area, whispers persist. Children, in the subdivision report, dreams of a tall man in old-fashioned clothing who invites them to join a special dinner party underground. Several families have reported finding their children sleepwalking toward the community pool area at night, drawn by what one child described as the sound of people singing from inside the earth. Most troubling are the disappearances, subtle, easily explained, yet persistent. A census comparison shows that, on average, the population of Wellspring Estates reports approximately 3% more relocations due to job transfers or family circumstances than similar communities in the region. Those who leave rarely maintain contact with neighbors they've left behind, their new addresses often proving to be non-existent when concerned former friends attempt to reconnect. County water testing has repeatedly shown trace contaminants in the Wellspring Estate supply that experts cannot readily identify, organic compounds that one researcher described as consistent with human decomposition, before abruptly retracting the statement and declining further comment. In 2020, a routine survey of the area using ground-penetrating radar for a planned highway expansion revealed what appeared to be extensive tunnel systems radiating outward from the former Caldwell property like spokes from a wheel. The survey results were classified by the Department of Transportation, citing national infrastructure security concerns, and the highway project was rerouted. Perhaps most disturbing is the pattern that emerges when plotting the locations of missing persons cases, within a 100-mile radius of Whispering Pines over the past century. The geographical distribution forms a distinct pattern when mapped, a pattern that bears an uncanny resemblance to the symbol found etched on the inside lid of Jeremiah Caldwell's journal. A well surrounded by 11 figures with their hands joined. For those who have studied the case closely, these connections suggest a terrifying possibility. That Jeremiah Caldwell's great work was not merely the actions of one disturbed individual, but the beginning of something that has continued to grow beneath the surface of ordinary life for generations. Cancer rooted in the dark soil of Macon County that has sent metastases spreading throughout the region. The full truth of the Caldwell horror may never be known. Too many records have been destroyed, too many witnesses silenced, too many investigations derailed by convenient accidents and sudden changes in official priorities. What remains are fragments, pieces of a puzzle whose complete picture might be too terrible to contemplate. As this account is written, new homes continue to be built at Wellspring Estates. New families move in, drawn by affordable prices and the promise of a peaceful community. Children play in yards built atop chambers whose existence has been officially denied. And somewhere, perhaps, descendants of Jeremiah Caldwell continue the work begun by their ancestor, selecting those deemed unworthy and ensuring they are preserved as eternal reminders of perceived failure. For those contemplating a move to Macon County, or to any community built upon land with a history longer than its official records acknowledge, perhaps the most prudent course is to ask not just about the water quality in school districts, but about what lies beneath the foundations, and why certain questions about local history are met with uncomfortable silence. The well has been covered. The chambers have been sealed. But if the pattern holds true, the work continues beneath our feet, expanding its reach with each generation. Have you ever noticed how some places feel wrong, as if the very air is saturated with past horrors? What would you do if you discovered your family had been entrusted with protecting a secret so dark that its revelation could unravel the very fabric of your community? The investigation into the Caldwell horror might have officially ended in 1921, but for some the search for answers was just beginning. Among those who could not let the case rest was Eleanor Whitaker, whose brief residence in the Caldwell house had left her permanently marked by its darkness. After relocating to Jacksonville, Florida, Eleanor gave birth to her daughter, whom she named Grace. As mentioned previously, the child was born with an unusual birthmark resembling handprints across her back. What was not included in official records was Eleanor's claim that the marks would occasionally change position, as if the invisible hands were slowly climbing higher. "I watch her while she sleeps," Eleanor wrote in her personal journal in 1923. "Sometimes I see the marks shift, like fingers flexing beneath her skin. The doctors say it's my imagination, a mother's anxiety manifesting in delusion. But I know what I see. Something followed us from that house, something that wants my child." Eleanor's obsession with the Caldwell case grew as her daughter did. While Thomas Whitaker attempted to put the experience behind them, focusing on building a new life in Florida, Eleanor maintained a clandestine correspondence with Deputy James Tucker, who shared her conviction that the official investigation had been deliberately curtailed. Tucker increasingly marginalized within the Macon County Sheriff's Department for his refusal to let sleeping dogs lie, provided Eleanor with copies of documents he had secretly preserved before the records office fire. These included several pages from Jeremiah Caldwell's journal that had never been entered into evidence. "The preservation is not merely physical," read one of these excluded passages, dated October 1885. "It is spiritual. Each vessel, once emptied of its rebellious spirit, becomes a reservoir that can be filled again. The chamber beneath the well is merely the beginning. With each addition, the network grows stronger. They speak to me now from below, not with their earthly voices, but with the unified voice of the collective. Soon we will extend our reach beyond this property, beyond this county. The worthy will be elevated. The unworthy will serve below." This passage, with its suggestion of something beyond mere murder and preservation, deeply disturbed Eleanor. She began researching Jeremiah Caldwell's life before his return to Georgia after the Civil War, discovering that he had spent 2 years in New Orleans, allegedly recovering from war injuries. During this period, According to records Eleanor obtained from the Louisiana Historical Society, Caldwell had become involved with a fringe religious group that combined elements of Christianity with older, darker practices involving the preservation of bodies. The group, which called itself the Eternal Fellowship, had been disbanded after several members were implicated in grave robbings and the disappearance of local children. The leader of this group, a man identified only as Brother Absalom in the few surviving records, had preached a doctrine centered around the creation of what he termed a living foundation, the belief that structures built upon properly prepared human remains would channel the energy of the deceased to benefit those who dwelled above. "I believe Caldwell brought these beliefs back to Georgia," Eleanor wrote to Tucker in 1925. "What we found was not merely a madman's collection, but the foundation of something he intended to grow. The well chamber was just one node in what he envisioned as a vast network beneath the earth. And I fear he may have succeeded more than we know." Tucker's response, the last communication Eleanor would receive from him, arrived 3 weeks later, a hastily scrawled note on plain paper rather than department letterhead. "Mrs. Whitaker, you must cease this investigation immediately. They know I've been sending you information. The connections go higher than I ever imagined. It's not just old Jeremiah. There were others, are others, who believe as he did. Prominent families, not just in our county, but throughout the state. I've found evidence that other chambers exist across Georgia, possibly beyond. They're watching me now. I'm sending everything I've gathered to my sister in Ohio for safekeeping. If anything happens to me, contact—" The note ended there, the paper torn as if it had been interrupted mid-writing. 3 days after Eleanor received it, the Macon County Gazette reported that Deputy James Tucker had died in what was described as a tragic accident at an abandoned well on the outskirts of town. His body was recovered after he apparently fell while conducting an unauthorized investigation into an old case. Eleanor, now genuinely frightened, attempted to contact Tucker's sister in Ohio, but her letters were returned unopened. Her inquiries to the sheriff's department about Tucker's personal effects were met with the information that all his possessions had been destroyed in a small fire at his residence the night of his death. Increasingly paranoid and convinced she was being watched, Eleanor began keeping her documentation of the Caldwell case in a locked box buried beneath the rose bushes in her garden. She told no one of her continued interest in the case, not even her husband, whom she had come to suspect might be influenced by the mysterious "they" Tucker had mentioned in his final note. Grace Whitaker grew into a troubled child. Though physically healthy, she suffered from persistent nightmares and sleepwalking episodes. By the age of 7, she had developed a habit of drawing the same image repeatedly, a circle of stick figures holding hands around what appeared to be a well, with a larger figure looking down from above. When asked about these drawings, Grace would only say, "The people under the ground told me to draw it. They sing to me at night." Concerned about her daughter's mental health, Eleanor took her to several specialists, none of whom could provide a satisfactory explanation for the child's behaviors or the increasingly distinct handprint marks on her back, which by then numbered exactly 11, matching the count of bodies found in the Caldwell well chamber. In 1929, shortly after Grace's 8th birthday, Eleanor woke in the night to find her daughter missing from her bed. After searching the house frantically, she found the child in the garden, digging with her bare hands at the spot where Eleanor had buried her documentation of the Caldwell case. "The people under the ground told me there are papers here," Grace reportedly told her mother, her eyes vacant. "Papers that need to go back to them." This incident convinced Eleanor that whatever force had inhabited the Caldwell property had followed them to Florida and was now working through her daughter. Desperate for help, she reached out to Dr. Malcolm Harris, an anthropologist specializing in folk religions and occult practices at Emory University in Atlanta. Dr. Harris, intrigued by the connections to the Eternal Fellowship, which he had studied previously, agreed to meet with Eleanor and Grace. His case notes, discovered among his effects after his death in 1962, provide a clinical assessment of their meeting. The child exhibits classic signs of possession or, in more scientific terms, a form of dissociative identity disorder triggered by trauma or suggestion. Most interesting is the birthmark phenomenon, which I was able to observe changing configuration during our session. The marks appear to move in response to certain topics of conversation, particularly when discussing the well chamber or Jeremiah Caldwell himself. This physiological response defies conventional medical explanation. Mrs. Whitaker's documentation of the Caldwell case, while fragmentary, suggests a concerning possibility. That Jeremiah Caldwell was not merely a deranged individual, but part of a larger network, practicing a form of ritualistic sacrifice and preservation with roots in antebellum secret societies. The architectural precision of the well chamber, as described in the salvaged reports, indicates knowledge of specific occult geometries designed to channel energy from the deceased to the living world above. Most disturbing is the possibility that the Caldwell horror was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern replicated across the region, creating what adherents might term a network of power nodes. Beneath the surface of respectable society, Dr. Harris recommended that Eleanor and Grace relocate immediately to a location outside the southeastern United States, suggesting that geographical distance might weaken whatever influence was affecting the child. He also advised Eleanor to entrust her documentation to him for safekeeping, as he had secure facilities at the university. Eleanor, however, had become wary of institutional involvement after Tucker's death and declined to surrender her evidence. Instead, she agreed to allow Dr. Harris to photograph the materials while she retained the originals. 3 weeks after this meeting, the Whitaker home in Jacksonville was destroyed in a fire that claimed the lives of Thomas Whitaker and 8-year-old Grace. Eleanor, who had been shopping in town at the time of the blaze, survived physically unharmed, but mentally shattered. Fire investigators determined that the blaze had originated in Grace's bedroom, apparently caused by candles arranged in a circular pattern on the floor. The report noted that the arrangement suggested ritualistic intent rather than accidental ignition. Eleanor, initially held for questioning on suspicion of involvement in what authorities considered a possible case of ritual murder-suicide committed by her husband, was eventually released due to lack of evidence and her verifiable alibi. She spent the following months in a sanatorium, treated for acute melancholia and paranoid delusions. Upon her release in early 1930, Eleanor disappeared from official records. Dr. Harris's notes indicate that he received a single postcard from her, postmarked from Seattle with only the message, "They have connections everywhere. The network extends further than we imagined. I'm going where they can't follow." Whether Eleanor Whitaker ever found peace from the horror that had followed her family from Georgia to Florida remains unknown. What is certain is that her documentation of the Caldwell case, which she had kept hidden from the fire that claimed her family, disappeared along with her. Dr. Harris continued his research into the Eternal Fellowship and its potential connections to prominent Southern families, but encountered increasing resistance from university administrators and funding bodies. His application for a research grant to examine architectural anomalies in wells and underground structures across Georgia was denied without explanation in 1932, and he was strongly encouraged to focus on less speculative areas of anthropological study. Despite these setbacks, Harris maintained a private file on what he termed the underground network, collecting newspaper accounts of unusual disappearances, ground subsidence, and unexplained phenomena associated with wells, caves, and other subterranean features throughout the Southeast. By the time of his death in 1962, this file contained over 300 incidents spanning nearly a century, many clustering around properties owned by families with historical connections to Jeremiah Caldwell or known members of the Eternal Fellowship. The file, along with Harris's other research materials, was bequeathed to his former graduate assistant, Dr. Margaret Collins, the same forensic anthropologist who would later attempt to conduct a formal study of the Caldwell case in 1989, only to have her funding abruptly terminated. Following this academic setback, Collins continued her investigation privately, focusing particularly on the architectural similarities in underground chambers discovered at various sites connected to her research. Her findings, documented in a self-published monograph titled Foundations of Fear: Architectural Anomalies in Southern Substructures, identified a consistent pattern in these chambers: circular construction, specific dimensions based on biblical numerology, and positioning relative to water sources that created what Collins termed acoustic amplification of subterranean sounds. These chambers were not designed merely for concealment, Collins wrote. They were constructed to enable communication, to allow something below to be heard above. The question that haunts me is not what Jeremiah Caldwell and those like him put into these chambers, but what they expected to emerge from them. In 2005, a nursing home resident in Tacoma, Washington, identified as Jane Doe due to lack of identification and apparent dementia, gained brief attention from local media after staff discovered she had covered the walls of her room with thousands of tiny, meticulous drawings of the same image, a circle of figures holding hands around a well. When asked about the drawings, the elderly woman, estimated to be in her 90s, would only repeat, "The network is complete now. Can't you hear them singing beneath us?" The great work continues. Researchers, investigating the Caldwell case years later, would discover that the timing of this incident coincided with the groundbreaking ceremony for the Wellspring Estates, development on the former Caldwell property in Georgia. The old woman died 3 weeks after completing her drawings, her identity never established. Among her few possessions was a tarnished silver locket containing a faded photograph of a young girl with a distinctive birthmark visible on her shoulder, a mark that, according to the attending nurse, looked exactly like a small handprint.